In a small provincial estate in the middle of nowhere, a child was born. The man, filled with worry, desired a boy. An old woman wrapped the child and assured him that his expectations and dreams had come true, for the child resembled the landlord. The woman then inquired whether the parents had chosen a name for their son. The child's mother replied that they would name him Paul Ardle, expressing her hope that Paul would become the light of the world. As a child, Paul was unremarkable. One day, while reading a book, he overheard a man asking another to gather as much seafood as possible. Intrigued, Paul called out to Uncle Frederick. When Frederick turned to him, he asked what the boy wanted. Paul, worried, cautioned the man against going to the street near South Mountain, claiming he had seen a strange flow of manna there. Confused, Frederick sought clarification from the boy's father, who also did not know how to respond. Suddenly, a thunderstorm erupted, prompting Frederick to rush into the building. Gray was already waiting at the doorway, expressing his concern about Frederick being late. Upon entering, Frederick explained that he had taken a longer route and apologized for his delay. Gray, still worried, inquired about what had happened. Frederick revealed that he had narrowly avoided trouble by heeding young Master Paul's warning. Gray was taken aback and asked what that could possibly mean. Frederick reminded him of Paul's warning from the previous day about avoiding the streets of South Mountain. It was only then that he learned of an attack by beastmen in that area. Shocked and surprised, Gray listened intently as Frederick continued, stating that everyone who had ventured there was in grave danger. Thanks to Paul, however, he had managed to stay safe. Reflecting on this, Gray became thoughtful and looked at the boy, questioning whether Paul might have the ability to sense manna in the air. Frederick admitted that he found it difficult to answer that question, but pondered the implications if it were true. If Paul could indeed sense manna, it would mean that he could become the future of Ardle. From that day forward, Paul exhibited an increasingly strong talent for magic. By the age of 6, he could sense manna, and by 7, he was able to manifest it. When he turned 10 years old, Frederick solemnly announced that he wished to hand over the floor to the representative of the first years. He requested the audience to greet the boy, who had surpassed countless children from prestigious families to gain admission to the Ignite Magic Academy, the most esteemed magic academy in the Radiant Kingdom. The solemn boy was hailed as the best among those entering the academy and was enrolled as the top applicant, thereby receiving the title. This attitude weighed heavily on Paul, though he consoled himself with the thought that his name would elevate the family's status. However, it could not be said that he was particularly successful in this regard. The man asked the boy to demonstrate his best skills among the applicants, and Paul tried to remain confident. Yet, on the very first day of classes, it became evident that he was far from being the best. He wasn't even the second best. The teacher demanded that he release his energy as quickly as possible, but Paul struggled to focus and failed to release enough. Confusion engulfed him as he grappled with understanding what he was doing wrong. All the students watched him with concern, and it soon became clear that he had a mana release disorder. Paul realized that he lacked the innate ability to release magic even a meter from his body. For a mage, his situation was literally the worst of the worst. It did not take long for others to discover his humble origins and his lack of magical talent, leading to a swift change in their attitudes towards him. One of his peers pushed him, causing Paul to nearly fall to the floor. A boy asked another if Paul was okay. Remaining silent, Paul listened as the other continued, remarking that his friend had just touched a disabled person and could become one too. The boy's friend jokingly suggested that he needed to wash himself quickly to avoid such a fate. Paul was immediately branded as someone incapable of using magic, labeled defective because he could not even cast spells at the Magic Academy. His current status was further diminished by the envious peers around him. The boy who had pushed him confronted Paul, questioning why he was looking at him like that. He swung his arm dismissively, asserting that Paul had no right to look at him because he was incapable of using magic. This new status became the greatest source of pleasure for those who envied him. Furious, Paul pounded the wall with his bare fist, while the boy struggled to catch his breath. Trying to comprehend the reality of the situation, Paul began to doubt whether he would ever become a magician. Paul Ardle, who had entered the academy with the best grades and was deemed more promising than anyone else, found all his advantages forgotten when faced with his curse. It was said that the genius had become disabled in magic. Despair consumed him. It felt as though everything had come to an end. However, he could not imagine that within the depths of his despair, there was room for a miracle. Suddenly, a notification appeared, announcing that the player artifact had been activated, and the status window was unlocked. The player artifact was now active. As Paul continued to fall deeper into his thoughts, he felt as if he were submerged underwater, disoriented and unsure of where he was. Something whispered to him that he was the embodiment of the destroyer of worlds. Confused and frightened, Paul struggled to comprehend the meaning of this revelation, unsure of what to believe or think. Suddenly, he was startled when a large figure loomed before him. As the large figure appeared in front of him, Paul was left speechless. The strange figure had open red eyes, and Paul initially thought it was just a dream. But the vividness of the scene suggested otherwise. Looking closer, he noticed the figure opening its mouth, realizing it wanted to give him an order. Suddenly, a picture flashed before his eyes, and he found himself transported far away from his current location. A few hours earlier at the training grounds of the Ignat Academy. This time, Paul heard his name called. The instructor explained that he only needed to create a fireball and hit the scarecrow with it, just as he had described before. Mike, another student, looked at Paul and thought this was a straightforward task that any student should be able to handle with ease. However, for someone who struggled to use magic, it was an almost impossible challenge. Despair washed over Paul as he doubted whether he would be able to succeed this time. Mike shouted at Paul, demanding that he start quickly. Realizing he needed to act fast, Paul concentrated on his hand, trying to isolate his mana. He believed in himself and was determined to complete the task at any cost. With a swift movement, he focused even harder on gathering mana in his hand. The surrounding students were shocked by the size of the ball he was forming, suggesting that he apparently had a significant amount of mana within him. Mike remained silent, watching closely as Paul attempted to demonstrate his abilities. Feeling a glimmer of belief in himself, Paul thought that if everything went well, he could manage this task. However, suddenly, anger surged within him as he realized that he was struggling once again. His hand stopped releasing mana, leaving him confused about what was happening. A moment later, fatigue overwhelmed him, and he coughed from exhaustion. Frustrated, Paul spat on the ground. Mike urged Paul to finally show his potential, but it seemed he was unable to do so. The instructor demanded that he release the mana from his body as quickly as possible. Paul admitted that the fireball did not leave his hand and expressed uncertainty about what to do next. Mike continued to press him, reminding Paul that he was already in his senior year and should have mastered such basics. According to Mike, if Paul could not perform simple magic like creating a fireball, he would surely fail the final exam. Yelling at Paul, Mike declared that he was destined to fail. Paul couldn't help but agree with that sentiment in his head. Clenching his fist, he apologized, vowing to try harder during practice. For this practical test, they were required to create 10 fireballs and hit the target multiple times. Unfortunately, Paul was unable to launch even one complete fireball toward the target. Realization dawned on him. He couldn't even aspire to be a third-rate mage. His peers mocked him, incredulous about how he had gained admission to the academy. Despite having the best scores, they repeatedly told him to give up, labeling him the main fool among them. Paul understood that the top scorer in the entrance exams had been the offspring of a nobleman from the province, which fueled envy among his classmates from more prestigious families, making them feel inferior. Paul realized that the hostility directed towards him stemmed from a deep-seated resentment. He understood he could not endure their mockery forever. The harsh reality had stripped him of hope, gradually eroding his personality from within. This curse, his mana release disorder, was the only thing that had held him back for the past 6 years. While he had managed to cope well during this time, he began to wonder how much longer he could hold on at this rate. In the hallway of the academy, the boys were animatedly discussing how their exams had gone. Someone in the crowd spotted Paul and shouted, calling him a dumbass. The usual tormentors chimed in, suggesting he should pack his things early. One boy remarked that if he were in Paul's place, he would be too embarrassed to show himself in public. However, Paul remained persistent. He asked his interlocutor if he knew what the younger students called him. The boy replied that everyone referred to him as a dumbass, claiming that because of Paul, The senior class was not a role model. The boys demanded that Paul return to his province as soon as possible. Laughing as they did so, Paul stayed silent. But one of the boys stated that nature usually rewarded individuals with either skills or wealth, claiming Paul was unlucky in both regards. Another boy added that all members of Paul's family were arrogant idiots who had never possessed anything worthwhile. Before the boy could finish speaking, Paul rushed forward and swung his fist with all his might, landing a punch squarely on his opponent's face. The other boy was shocked to see his friend pushed back several meters by just one blow. Fueled by fury, Paul demanded that the boy repeat what he had said about his father. Misunderstanding Paul's intentions, the boy resorted to name-calling while wiping away the blood from his face. He did not believe that someone from a simple family could possess such strength. Paul asserted that one should know when to stop, insisting that these boys were nobodies when it came to discussing his family. Suddenly, the boy's friend charged at Paul, attempting to punch him back. However, Paul was quicker than his opponent had expected, and he knocked the attacker out with a single punch. The boy fell to his knees, clutching his stomach, while his friend looked on in disbelief, unable to comprehend how such power could be hidden within someone perceived as weak. The boy with golden hair, furious, decided to take revenge using magic. He insisted that Paul had no right to touch him. Paul couldn't believe that his opponent would resort to magic in the academy itself. Despite the risk of expulsion, the boy was determined and released a magical sphere aimed directly at Paul. Demanding that he die, Paul felt paralyzed, unable to move, as he noticed a teacher rushing towards them, shouting for them to stop immediately. Unfortunately, it was too late for Paul. As Paul touched the opponent's magic, he instinctively covered his face, unsure of what would happen next. Just as he feared, it seemed that his end had come. He felt like the embodiment of the destroyer of worlds. Suddenly, a status window unlocked, and a player artifact activated, revealing a large figure with glowing red eyes in front of him. Paul was bewildered, not understanding what was happening to him or where he was. The imposing figure opened its mouth and called out to him, uttering his full name. Paul looked into its eyes with horror, certain that it was indeed his name. Abruptly, the darkness began to fade, and he slowly opened his eyes, hearing his name being called once more. When he finally focused, he saw Chloe standing over him. The teacher expressed her relief that he had finally woken up. For a moment, Paul realized that everything he had experienced was true. He attempted to sit up and asked where he was. Chloe urged him to lie back down, explaining that he was in the break room and needed to rest. She insisted that he should recuperate, but Paul insisted that nothing terrible had happened to him. He was just feeling dizzy. Confused, he questioned whether he had lost consciousness. The vividness of the figure he had seen seemed so real to him in that moment. Curious about how long he had been lying there, Paul asked Chloe for an answer. She informed him that she had been watching over him all day. Chloe considered it fortunate that he had escaped with such light consequences. Concerned, Paul asked if he was okay now. She reassured him that they needed to conduct a few more tests, but he looked pretty good for someone who had taken a direct hit from a lightning ball. According to her, he had no wounds or burns, and even his organs were intact. She noted that she had encountered this situation for the first time. Paul struggled to comprehend how this was possible. He knew that a lightning ball was a devastating form of magic that could incinerate a body in seconds. Yet he had taken a direct hit and felt fine. Just then, the professor entered the room and apologized for disturbing him. Chloe mentioned that she would go analyze the results of Paul's tests since the professor was attending to him. She encouraged him not to remain silent if anything was troubling him. Mike then approached the bed and inquired about how Paul was feeling. Paul responded that he felt absolutely fine. Mike expressed his satisfaction with this news, but added that a whole professorial council was being assembled for the occasion. He assured Paul that his attacker would be expelled without fail. Mike explained that the boy was being expelled for using combat magic with the intent to kill, as well as for spreading false rumors about the head of the family. He also highlighted that the boy had treated Paul unfairly and bullied him. According to Mike, all of these actions were taken into account when making the verdict. Paul lowered his head, contemplating the gravity of the situation. Mike mentioned that he had also hit him and acknowledged that he would, of course, be punished too. However, given the circumstances, he said he would only be doing volunteer service for a month. Mike then expressed that he had one more question, something he was eager to know, whether the boy had an artifact. Paul was taken aback by this inquiry and replied that it was certainly not true. If he had something like that, he reasoned, he would not be bullied by those around him. Thinking it over, Mike assumed that, due to the rarity and value of such an artifact, the head of the boy's family would have already utilized it for his people. Paul, intrigued, asked why Mike was even asking about this. The man hesitated but decided to answer. He confidently stated that before the lightning ball had overtaken the boy, his body seemed to be surrounded by a red light, as if a high-ranking artifact was protecting him from the magic. Paul struggled to believe what he was hearing. While he knew what an artifact was, he found it hard to accept such a notion. Suddenly, a connection formed in his mind with the strange dream he had experienced. He admitted to Mike that he did not understand what had happened to him, and certainly did not possess an artifact. Mike, albeit reluctantly, agreed with him and began to head for the exit, telling the boy to get some rest. Confused, Paul was left pondering the events and realized he had undergone an experience indistinguishable from a dream. He recalled the strange voice that had been calling him, a voice that proclaimed the artifact was open and accessible and spoke of some player. Although Paul remembered that the statue had mentioned something else, he found it difficult to grasp the entirety of his memory. Suddenly, he noticed a status window right in front of him. At that moment, Chloe approached, holding some papers in her hands. Paul recognized that this was real, and she asked him what was happening and if he was feeling well. He clarified that it wasn't about his health, but rather something he had seen, right in front of him. He attempted to explain the blue thing to Chloe, but she looked confused, insisting that there was nothing there. Doubting his sanity, Paul himself struggled to believe that she truly couldn't see the window. The notification table displayed all the information about him, and he realized that only he could perceive it. In an attempt to cover up his bewilderment, Paul first suggested that he must have squinted, but Chloe dismissed it, stating it wasn't funny at all. According to her, his tests were normal, and he could return to the dorm. Grateful, Paul thanked her and mentally listed the day's extraordinary events. He had survived a lightning ball strike without consequences, met a man with a red eye from an alternate dimension, and received a status window visible only to him. The window asserted that he was the incarnation of DRA, leading him to wonder if perhaps the Mage artifact had indeed been bestowed upon him. Another strange window appeared before Paul's eyes, presenting him with a task. He was required to prepare his body for increased strength through training. As he read the list, he realized that physical activity was expected of him. Although he did not understand how this could benefit a mage like him, he decided to try it without hesitation. After hitting with one fist, he noticed that his strength had increased. When he struck twice, the increase was even more pronounced. Paul quickly realized that the number was growing, and at this rate, he would reach his goal in no time. However, after another hit, he saw that the number remained unchanged. Looking at the window again, he understood that the hit had not been counted. If there was even the slightest mistake in its execution, it would not register. Determined, he resolved to go through the training properly. It was night outside, and Paul was very tired. He felt a sense of relief wash over him as he finally finished. Sweat poured down his face, and the window confirmed that the task was completed, indicating an increase in his strength. To his surprise, he heard about the reward. He noticed a strange feeling within himself, barely noticeable but distinct. It was something in his blood, something more than mana. He realized that he had indeed become stronger after this training. Eager to test his newfound strength in real life, Paul struck out with one blow, breaking something in front of him. He felt mana gathering around his hand, and realized that both his strength and magic had become significantly more powerful. The speed of air resistance and his overall strength felt completely different. Fundamentally, he had increased. Now, he anticipated a second reward, and the status window reappeared before him. The next task involved a power circle. Paul read that he needed to replace his mana circles with power circles. He understood that after completing this task, his mana would be supplanted by physical strength. Everyone who studies mana has a circle around their heart, as mana plays an important role in releasing and strengthening it. The number of these circles increases depending on the accumulated mana that a mage can control. Paul had 4 mana circles, which was much more than what was typically found in people his age. However, Due to his disorder, they were effectively as good as zero. Suddenly, Paul realized something alarming. He felt that the mana circles in his heart had actually disappeared. In their place, a force was circulating madly, replaced now by power circles. Paul was surprised by this new sensation. The power circles were instead of mana circles. Unsure of what this meant, he recalled that he knew nothing about mages without mana circles. He wondered what would happen to him if he completely replaced his circles. The thought crossed his mind that he could potentially forget about life as a mage altogether. Yet, he concluded it was too early to succumb to despair. First, he needed to test his abilities in action. Deciding to use a fireball, Paul was astonished at how easily he created it in his hand. It formed quickly, almost impossibly so in his opinion. As he looked at the size of the fireball, he realized the extent of the unknown power he now possessed. The power of the artifact provided Paul with a unique opportunity. Magic operated on a basic principle, typically requiring an average of 10 seconds to release. However, it seemed that he had found a way to skip this stage and create a fireball due to his internal strength. He understood that this was undoubtedly the power of the artifact. After another training session, Paul noticed a window appearing beside him. Unsure of what task awaited him, he read the instructions and learned that he needed to fill his body with magic to perform an attack. However, he did not know how to achieve this. He recalled that Dra, someone he thought might have suffered from a similar disorder, fought by filling his fists and legs with magic. Paul was uncertain how he had come to this method. Suddenly, he noticed that a new task had appeared for him, which surprised him greatly. He had to hit a target. Until that moment, he had not even considered using physical force as a method. He had doubted whether he could become a magician through such means. But he resolved to find his strength nonetheless. In a matter of seconds, he released a fireball, feeling a surge of joy when it worked. The task was completed, and he gained strength from the accomplishment. Exhausted, Paul sat down on the ground to rest. He felt incredibly happy to have finally completed the task. Reflecting on his journey, he remembered how every previous failure had been at the discharge stage. Now, he had overcome that hurdle and was able to feel magic at full strength. Despite his success, he remained skeptical that anyone could devise such a method. He wished to learn more about Dra, but felt his body growing heavy. As he struggled to stay awake, he heard voices nearby. Someone commented that it seemed he had trained until dawn and literally fallen asleep on the spot. Confused, Paul gradually regained consciousness, continuously hearing these voices. One person remarked that he was definitely not dead, especially after surviving the lightning ball. Paul could not comprehend why his head felt so noisy, and the crowd around him appeared surprised by his sudden return. They asked him not to scare them like that again. Rising from the ground, Paul stretched and remarked that they were acting strangely, as if they had never seen someone sleeping on the street. The group fell silent, and one of the boys noted that this behavior was not typical for a nobleman attending a respectable academy. He inquired if Paul had been drinking, to which Paul dismissed them, insisting that he was simply very tired and had fallen asleep from exhaustion. Despite Paul's explanation, the others remained perplexed and whispered among themselves, noting that he was acting oddly. One friend gazed at the spot where the scarecrow used to be, astonished that nothing remained of it. He suggested that it might have been Paul who caused its disappearance. The others dismissed the idea, insisting that he did not know how to handle magic. As Paul entered the academy dormitory, Jason greeted him warmly, recognizing the toll the night had taken on him. As Paul brushed his teeth, he was surprised to see that Jason had only just returned. When Jason inquired if anything had happened, Paul replied that it was none of his business. Although the eldest son of a famous family, Paul sensed that his interlocutor was not hostile towards him. With a sly tone, Jason asked if Paul had really been with a girl, knowing that he was somewhat obsessed with alcohol and women, which often led him to leave the academy grounds secretly, not wanting to engage further. Paul threw some clothes in Jason's face, insisting he had just come from the bathroom and had no idea what Jason was talking about. Now, relaxing in warm water, Paul felt better but suddenly remembered he had an additional task to check on. He needed to prepare his body through training. Paul was surprised to learn that while the rewards for his efforts remained the same, the number of required repetitions had doubled. He questioned whether his progress would continue at this rate, aware that the journey ahead would not be easy. Nevertheless, he was determined to do whatever it took to become a mage. A month had passed since then, and Paul discovered that the repeating task could be completed once a day. However, unlike the constant rewards, the required number of repetitions seemed to grow daily. If he couldn't complete the building within a day, all his progress would reset. Because of this, Paul never missed a day of training. Despite the challenges, he found some benefit in the situation, relieved that the requirements for completing tasks didn't exceed 3,000 repetitions. Otherwise, he worried he might not survive the process. Over the past month, Paul had dedicated himself to these training sessions daily, even acquiring a new skill that brought him joy when he read its characteristics. Meanwhile, his friends were discussing Paul's strange behavior lately. They noticed he had been sleeping during lessons, a stark contrast to his previous attentiveness in class. One of his friends expressed outrage that this was all they had observed, pointing out that Paul had actually moved to the training ground to practice kicks. Another friend suggested they ignore him, noting that Paul had always been peculiar. They speculated that he was trying to compensate for his issues through this rigorous training, though they believed it wasn't working. Despite completing tasks and seeking clues about DRA's identity, Paul struggled to find any information on a mage by that name in historical records. He collected books one by one, yet nothing yielded results. He pondered only one question: who DRA was, feeling a deep curiosity about the individual who had granted him such power. Just then, Jason ran in, asking if Paul had heard any news. Confused, Paul assumed that since he had been calmly reading books, he was unaware of any developments. When Jason informed Paul that something serious had happened, Paul quickly inquired about it. Jason revealed that the head of the Ardle family had arrived at the academy, which took Paul by surprise. The thought that his father was there shook him, and he hurriedly ran to the exit, calling out for his father as he dashed down the corridor. As he ran, he spotted a man talking to someone else, and when the man turned his attention to Paul, the boy felt a wave of happiness wash over him. They had set aside time to talk, and Paul wasted no time asking how his father had been, noting that it had been 6 years since he had been sent to the academy. His father replied that he was doing well, as always. Curious about his sister, Paul asked how she was faring. Gray, his father, mentioned that she had matured considerably and had begun studying the art of swordsmanship, expressing her desire to protect her weaker brother. Paul scratched the back of his head, feeling somewhat awkward upon hearing this. Gray reassured him that the girl had always been confident in herself. After a moment of silence, Paul finally replied that he was doing well. Gray, puzzled by his son's vague words, pressed him for clarification. Paul insisted that he was truly fine and that no one was abusing him, either physically or mentally. As Gray sipped his tea, he contemplated his son's situation. Gray eventually admitted that he had come to the academy to see if Paul wanted to leave. He wanted to convey that if Paul was struggling, the doors of their home would always be open to him. Gray was eager to understand what difficulties his son had faced during his time at the academy. Taking a moment to think, Paul decided to be frank in their conversation. He expressed that he had been treated poorly from the very beginning, but quickly reassured his father that he seemed to have found a way out of the situation. Paul proposed that they come to an agreement right away. He explained that a practical test was approaching, and he was obliged to show good results. He promised that if he failed the test, he would do as his father wished. With determination, he assured Gray that he would achieve excellent results in the practical exam, hoping to convince his father of his resolve before he returned to the estate. Finally, the long-awaited day of the exam arrived, drawing everyone's attention as the start of the written exam on understanding magic was announced. The students were warned that any violation would result in their scores being reset. As they were permitted to begin, Paul took up his pen. The exam consisted of both written and practical parts, with the practical portion further divided into 4 categories: aim shooting, measuring magical power, real combat, and one-on-one combat. As someone who struggled with a disorder of magic release, Paul performed exceptionally well in the written part. Throughout the training period, the first place in the practical section was consistently claimed by another student from an influential family. However, Paul was confident that this time everything would be different. He believed he deserved first place this year.